One might be forgiven for thinking that the nadir of American intellectual life had been reached with the advent of cable news, shouting matches, and Twitter theology. But no, the entrepreneurial spirit of the American charlatan knows no depths to which it will not gleefully plunge. Enter PragerU, an organization whose very name is an exercise in fraud. It is, after all, not a university by any definition that wouldn't send Socrates reaching for the hemlock a second time. This glorified YouTube channel, the brainchild of talk radio demagogue Dennis Prager and his associate Alan Estrin, represents that peculiarly American synthesis of commercial hucksterism, religious cant, and political reaction that would be comic if it weren't now being injected directly into the bloodstream of public education. That this pseudo-educational outfit has been approved for classroom use in Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, and New Hampshire is an indictment of the very notion that we collectively give a damn whether the next generation can distinguish fact from propaganda. Let us begin with the essential dishonesty at PragerU's core. When they discovered that founding an actual university would require the inconvenient expenditure of $250 million and the even more burdensome task of hiring actual scholars and producing actual knowledge, they pivoted with admirable cynicism to what Estrin called the medium of internet video. Why bother with the tedious work of education when you can produce slick 5-minute videos that provide all the intellectual nourishment of a fast food meal and leave viewers with roughly the same effect on their cognitive health? The funding sources alone should give any thinking person pause. Fracking billionaires Dan and Faris Wilks have poured millions into this enterprise, alongside the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, that venerable patron of movement conservatism. One might ask, what interest do fossil fuel magnates have in children's education? The answer becomes grimly apparent when one examines PragerU's content on climate change, which promotes systematic denialism and argues with breathtaking sophistry that fossil fuels are actually good for the environment. Now to the content itself, which manages the impressive feat of being simultaneously vapid and venomous. Consider their treatment of American slavery, surely one of history's great crimes, and a stain that no amount of constitutional waterboarding can cleanse. In an animated video titled Leo and Layla Meet Frederick Douglass, PragerU has the temerity to put words in the mouth of that great abolitionist, having him describe slavery as a compromise that was worth it to achieve American unity. This is rather like having Anne Frank pop up to explain that the Holocaust, while regrettable, was necessary for German industrial development. The historical Douglass, shortly before his death, when asked how to advance civil rights, responded with one word repeated 3 times: agitate, agitate, agitate. PragerU's cartoon Douglass, by contrast, essentially counsels, compromise, wait, trust the system. Their animated Douglass even takes a swipe at radical activists who refuse all compromise and like to set things on fire. A barely veiled attack on the Black Lives Matter movement that would be subtle if subtlety weren't anathema to everything PragerU represents. The video cherry-picks Douglass's description of the Constitution as a glorious liberty document, while conveniently omitting his denunciation in the same 1852 speech. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. And his pointed question about whether Black Americans were included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. This is historical necrophilia, the violation of a great man's memory in service of a contemporary political agenda. The Frederick Douglass desecration is simply the most egregious example in an extensive catalogue of mendacity. PragerU has spread demonstrable falsehoods about COVID-19, promoted climate change denial, including false claims about polar bear populations and the relationship between fossil fuels and environmental health, and produced videos arguing that fascism is a left-wing ideology, a claim so historically illiterate that it insults both history and literacy simultaneously. Academic research has found that PragerU has fundamental overlapping ideologies to the extreme right, and uses information laundering and persuasion techniques used on online platforms by white supremacists. Their anti-LGBTQ content is particularly vicious, including a film titled Detrans, The Dangers of Gender-Affirming Care, launched with a $1 million marketing campaign, because nothing says educational nonprofit quite like spending $1 million to terrify parents about their transgender children. But perhaps the most revealing moment came at a Moms for Liberty convention, when Dennis Prager, accused of indoctrinating children, didn't deny it. He said, and I quote, "All he heard was people saying that he indoctrinates kids," which is true, he admitted. PragerU brings doctrines to children. And then he asked, "What is the bad of our indoctrination?" "There it is," the quiet part said loud. At least the Soviet propagandists had the decency to pretend they were doing something other than indoctrination. One cannot discuss PragerU without addressing the religious rot at its core. The organization explicitly markets Judeo-Christian values as educational content, and their Leo and Layla series includes time travel adventures to meet biblical characters, all of which is now being peddled in taxpayer-funded public schools. This from a nation whose constitution explicitly prohibits religious establishments, and whose First Amendment exists precisely to prevent the kind of sectarian indoctrination that PragerU is now delivering to captive audiences of children in government-run classrooms. The God-bothering is central to PragerU's mission. Prager himself, an Orthodox Jew who once earned the sobriquet "the Jewish Billy Graham," has stated that he created PragerU to combat what he regards as leftist and secular indoctrination in universities, that tired persecution complex of the permanently aggrieved. The organization's stated mission is to promote what it calls Judeo-Christian values as a bulwark against secularism. One might gently suggest that if your worldview cannot withstand scrutiny from educated people, the problem lies with your worldview rather than with education itself. PragerU wraps itself in the flag with the fervor of someone who mistakes nationalism for thought and jingoism for argument. They claim to promote the American values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while simultaneously arguing against a $15 an hour minimum wage, promoting anti-immigrant sentiment, and defending the Electoral College with sophistries that would embarrass a freshman debater. One video grotesquely claims that slavery was a part of life all over the world. It was America that began the conversation to end it. A statement so disconnected from historical fact that one scarcely knows where to begin. The Republic of Ragusa outlawed the slave trade in 1416. Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, France in 1848, and numerous other nations preceded the United States. The United States didn't manage abolition until 1865, and only then after a catastrophic civil war that killed over 600,000 Americans. To claim that America began the conversation requires not merely ignorance, but active hostility toward truth. That any State Department of Education would approve this dreck for classroom use represents a civilizational failure of the first order. We are talking about material that has been rated as having low factual reporting by media bias, fact check, and questionable overall credibility, with multiple failed fact checks on climate change, race, and COVID-19. Historians, researchers, and educators have uniformly condemned these materials as misleading, distorted, and inappropriate for educational settings. Yet here we are, watching as Florida, that laboratory of educational malpractice, and other states incorporate PragerU's materials into taxpayer-funded schools. This, despite the fact that prominent historians like Andrew Hartman call their Frederick Douglass video an appalling misuse that mischaracterizes his role in U.S. history, and University of Pennsylvania education professor Jonathan Zimmerman describes PragerU as a political propaganda machine that promotes mistruths about climate change, slavery, and a whole host of other things. What PragerU represents is the systematic replacement of knowledge with ideology, of critical thinking with catechism, of history with hagiography. It is the prostitution of pedagogy in service of plutocracy, seasoned with a healthy dose of theocratic yearning and white grievance politics. The tragedy is that we have reached such a nadir of civic and intellectual standards that state governments will eagerly inject this poison into classrooms, wrapped in the flag and bearing the false credentials of educational legitimacy. One thinks of Jefferson's dictum that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Perhaps we should add that eternal skepticism is the price of education, and that we have failed to pay that price. PragerU thrives because of certain American values, specifically the values of anti-intellectualism, religious absolutism, and the conviction that patriotism consists of never questioning one's country except to complain that it has insufficient piety. If this is what we're teaching our children, then perhaps we deserve the ignorant, superstitious, and easily manipulated citizenry we're so assiduously cultivating. The ghost of Frederick Douglass, that genuine American hero, must look upon this travesty with the same horror he once reserved for the auction block itself. PragerU is a lie wrapped in a fraud, served with a side of historical revisionism and religious fundamentalism, all funded by fossil fuel money and packaged with the production values of Saturday morning cartoons. That it has found its way into American classrooms is a civic catastrophe that future generations will study as evidence of how easily a democracy can abandon its commitment to truth in favor of comforting fictions and profitable propaganda. And Dennis Prager's question, what is the bad of our indoctrination, deserves an answer. Everything, Mr. Prager, everything.